The rain had been falling since before dawn, and Rosa Langston was losing her mind one drip at a time. She stood in the middle of the single-room schoolhouse on the edge of Caldwell, Kansas, in the autumn of 1882, holding a tin bucket in each hand, while a third one she had already placed near the blackboard collected water with a rhythmic, maddening ping. The roof had been threatening to give way for the better part of 3 weeks. She had written to the County Board of Education twice, once politely and once with considerably less patience, asking for either the funds to repair it or the labor to see it done. The County Board of Sumner County had responded to both letters with the same bureaucratic indifference that she had come to expect from men who sat in dry offices and made decisions about buildings they never visited. So here she was, a 26-year-old schoolteacher from Ohio who had come west 2 years ago with a trunk full of books and a stubborn belief that children on the frontier deserved a proper education, standing in the leaking wreckage of her ambitions and listening to the rain destroy everything she had worked for. The children, thankfully, were not present. She had dismissed them early when the first serious drip appeared over the reading table, sending them home with the pages of the McGuffey readers tucked under their arms and a promise that school would resume as soon as the weather permitted. That had been this morning. It was now well past noon, and the rain showed no intention of relenting. Rosa set down one of the buckets and moved the small wooden desk closer to the dry corner near the door, where the roof still held. She had arranged her few personal items there, her lesson plan journal, her collection of maps she had ordered from a printer in St. Louis, the small framed photograph of her mother and father that she kept facing outward so the children could see that teachers had families too. She wrapped the maps in oilcloth and stacked them beneath the desk, then turned to survey the damage with the resigned expression of someone who had learned that the frontier did not care about your plans. The door rattled. Rosa looked up. She had not heard footsteps over the sound of the rain hammering the roof, but the latch was lifting and the door swung inward, letting in a gust of wet autumn air and the silhouette of a man so tall he had to dip his head under the frame. He was soaking wet. There was no other way to describe it. His dark canvas duster was black with rain, his hat brim bent low and pouring water like a trough spout, and his boots left dark prints on the wooden floor as he stepped inside. He was perhaps 30 years old, broad through the shoulders, with a jaw that had not seen a razor in several days, and eyes the color of the creek bottom after a good rain, a deep, unremarkable gray that took in the room with a steady, assessing calm. He carried a canvas bag in one hand and a coil of rope in the other. Rosa straightened. "Can I help you?" she asked, because she was a woman alone in a building with a stranger, and she had learned not to let uncertainty show in her voice. He looked at her for a moment. Then he looked at the ceiling, tracking the drips with a slow, methodical gaze that moved from bucket to bucket. Then he looked at the door again, as if calculating something. He set the canvas bag on the floor near the entrance, turned around and walked back out into the rain. Rosa stood there with the bucket in her hand and blinked. She heard boot steps on the roof not 30 seconds later. She stood very still, listening. There were careful, deliberate footfalls moving across the shingles overhead, not the reckless scramble of someone in a hurry, but the measured weight of a man who knew how to move on a sloped surface in the rain. Something scraped, something knocked. Then a rhythmic, steady pounding began, the unmistakable sound of a hammer driving nails. Rosa walked slowly to the door and opened it, stepping under the narrow overhang to look up. The man was on the roof. He had shed his duster and left it somewhere, and his gray wool shirt was dark with rain across the shoulders, his suspenders 2 dark lines against the fabric. He had a leather tool belt buckled at his hip, a hammer in his right hand, and he was working a piece of cedar shingle into a gap near the ridge with the focused efficiency of someone who had done this kind of work many times before. He did not look down at her. He did not look up at the sky, which was doing its absolute best to make his work impossible. He simply worked, moving along the ridge line with the unhurried certainty of a man who had decided something was going to get done and had closed the conversation on that topic with himself. Rosa watched him for a long moment. The rain pattered on the brim of her bonnet and ran down her shoulders. She opened her mouth to say something, to ask who he was, or what he thought he was doing, or whether he needed any help, and then she closed it again. Something in the way he moved told her that words would be received the way most unsolicited advice is received by a skilled man in the middle of a job, which is to say, not at all. She went back inside. She moved the buckets to catch the remaining drips, dried the floor where she could, and began to organize her classroom with the quiet purposefulness that she used when she needed to feel in control of something. She sorted the slates. She arranged the primers on the shelf. She refilled the ink bottles from the glass jug she kept in the supply cabinet. And all the while, the hammering continued overhead, steady as a heartbeat, and one by one the drips slowed and stopped. By the time the rain began to ease and the gray afternoon light changed to something paler and more hopeful, the roof had gone silent. Then came the sound of careful boots on the ladder she kept propped against the back wall, and then boot steps on the ground, and then nothing for a long moment. Rosa was standing at the blackboard, writing the next day's arithmetic lesson, when the door opened again. The man stepped inside. He was still very wet. He bent down and picked up his canvas bag, checked its contents briefly, and slung it over his shoulder. He straightened and turned toward the door. "Wait," Rosa said. He stopped. His back was to her, his hand resting against the doorframe, and he turned his head just slightly, not quite enough to look at her directly, but enough to show that he was listening. "At least tell me your name," she said, "so I know who to thank." There was a pause that lasted long enough for the last of the rain to drip from the eaves, and for a sparrow to land on the fence post outside the window and immediately leave again. "Walter," he said. His voice was low and even, like a creek moving over flat ground. "Walter Brenner," and then he walked out. Rosa stood at the blackboard with the chalk still in her hand, and listened to the sound of his horse moving away through the softening mud, and she looked up at the ceiling, where the plaster was still damp but the dripping had stopped entirely, and she felt something shift in the middle of her chest that she did not immediately have a name for. She would learn his name soon enough. Caldwell, Kansas, in 1882 was not a large town. It sat at the edge of the Kishom Trail, which meant it was loud and rough for half the year when the cattle drives came through, and quieter and harder for the other half when the winter closed in, and the dust settled, and people were left alone with themselves and their decisions. It was a town of saloons and stockyards and a barber shop and a general store, and a church that doubled as a meeting hall and a courthouse that was only slightly more dignified than a barn. Rosa had come to know it the way teachers know every town they work in, from the inside out, through the children, who told her without knowing they were telling her everything about who their parents were and what they needed. She asked about Walter Brenner the next morning at Patton's General Store, where she went for chalk and a new ink bottle. Margaret Patton, who was 53 years old and had seen every kind of person pass through Caldwell in 30 years of running the store with her husband, looked at Rosa with an expression of mild amusement. "Walt Brenner," Margaret said, leaning both elbows on the counter. "He's been around these parts about 4 years now. Has a spread out east of town past the creek, maybe 3-4 miles. Runs cattle, keeps to himself. Rides for the Hendersons sometimes when they need extra hands on the drives. He is a good man." She paused in a way that suggested the statement was more complete than it appeared. "Quiet, very quiet. Some folks think he is strange because of it. He is not strange. He just does not see the point in talking about things that do not need talking about." Rosa absorbed this. "He fixed my roof yesterday," she said, "in the rain, without saying anything." Margaret nodded as though this was the most unsurprising information she had received all week. "That sounds about right for Walt," she said. Rosa bought her chalk and her ink bottle and walked back to the schoolhouse in the clear autumn morning with the sky washed blue and the mud drying slowly in the lanes. And she thought about a man who fixed things without being asked, and without saying a word. And she thought about what kind of life produced that kind of person. The children came back the next day, 16 of them ranging in age from 6 to 14, and Rosa opened the school with the particular fierce energy she brought to mornings after difficulty, the kind that said the difficulty had not won. They read from the McGuffey readers and worked sums on their slates, and in the afternoon she told them about the geography of the territories, about the Kishom Trail and the Kansas prairie, and the way the land shaped the people who lived on it. She loved the afternoons best, when the children were tired enough to listen rather than fidget, and she could feel their imaginations opening like windows. After school, as the last of the children filed out into the late afternoon light, she stepped onto the small porch and looked at the roof. He had done a thorough job. Not just patched the worst of the gaps, but replaced a whole section of shingles along the ridge and resecured the fascia boards that had been pulling loose on the north side. She could see where the new cedar was brighter than the weathered old shingles around it, raw and pale, like a new scar next to old skin. It would darken and blend within a season. In the meantime, it was solid, and she found she was glad of it in a way that went beyond simply having a dry schoolhouse. She saw him again 4 days later. She was coming back from a home visit. She made them whenever a child had been absent more than 2 days, because she had learned that absence was rarely simple laziness and usually meant something harder, and she was walking along the main road when she saw him coming out of the farrier's shop. He was leading a big sorrel horse with a fresh shoe and a rolled-up something under his arm. He had not yet seen her. She made a decision of the type she recognized in herself as irrevocable. She walked toward him. "Mr. Brenner," she said. He stopped. He looked at her with those gray, creek-bottom eyes that held a particular quality of attention that she had rarely encountered, the quality of someone who was actually going to hear what she said rather than waiting for her to finish so he could say what he had already decided. "Miss Langston," he said, and she was startled that he knew her name, and then not startled at all, because she was the schoolteacher and everyone knew the schoolteacher. "I owe you a proper thank you," she said. He shifted his weight and looked briefly at the road, as though he found this conversation less comfortable than being on a wet roof. "Roof needed fixing," he said. "It did," she agreed. "I had written to the county board twice and received no response worth mentioning." Something moved in his expression, not quite a smile, but the shadow of one, an interior acknowledgement of something that might have been wry contempt for county boards. "Not much for action, county boards," he said. "No," she said. "They are not." There was a moment of silence that was not, she noticed, particularly uncomfortable. He was not the kind of man who rushed to fill silence, and she found, to her own surprise, that she was not either, at least not with him. "Do you live nearby?" she asked, because she wanted to keep the conversation going and could not think of a more elegant way to do it. "East of town," he said, "past the creek." Margaret Patton mentioned, she said, and then wished she had not, because it implied she had been asking about him, which she had been, but which she had not quite intended to admit. He looked at her directly for the first time with something that was not quite amusement but was in the same family. "Did she?" he said. It was not a question. "She said you are a good man," Rosa said, deciding that if she was already caught in the admission she might as well use it. "She said you do not see the point in talking about things that do not need talking about." He considered this. "Margaret Patton is a sensible woman," he said. "She is," Rosa agreed. And then, before she could stop herself, "Would you like to have supper sometime, Mr. Brenner? As a proper thank you. I board with the Harmons on Elm Street, and Mrs. Harmon sets a good table." The silence that followed this invitation was long enough that Rosa had time to consider the various ways the next 10 seconds might go. He could decline. He could accept. He could say something awkward that would make the next several months of seeing him in a small town very uncomfortable. The wind picked up and moved a handful of dry leaves across the road between them. "All right," he said. It was not an elaborate acceptance. It was not accompanied by a smile or a flourish or any of the social performances that Rosa had learned to expect from men who wanted you to know they were pleased. It was just a simple, direct word, offered as plainly as he did everything else. "Saturday evening," she said. "Saturday," he agreed. He touched the brim of his hat, a single, economical gesture, and led his horse on down the road. Rosa stood in the middle of the street and watched him go and felt the thing in her chest again, the one she had not named yet. This time it felt less uncertain and more like recognition, like looking at a word in a foreign language and suddenly understanding what it meant. Mrs. Adele Harmon, who was a plump, cheerful widow of 50 who had taken Rosa in as a boarder and treated her with the particular warm bossiness that passes for deep affection in small towns, was delighted by the news that Rosa was having a guest for supper on Saturday. "Walter Brenner," she said, with the same weighted pause that Margaret Patton had used, and Rosa was beginning to understand that this pause meant something specific and important in the vocabulary of Caldwell, Kansas. "Well," Adele said. Well, he fixed my roof," Rosa said. "I heard," Adele said. She had heard approximately 20 minutes after it happened, which was about normal for information velocity in a town this size. "He is a decent man, Rosa. Been through some hard things. Quiet since." Rosa wanted to ask what the hard things were, but something told her that was Walter's story to tell in his own time, and she decided she could be patient. Saturday came with the particular crystalline quality of a Kansas autumn day, cold at the edges but brilliant in the middle, the kind of day that made the prairie look like it had been polished. Rosa wore her good blue dress, which she had brought from Ohio and which she saved for occasions that deserved it, and arranged her dark hair more carefully than usual, and then felt foolish for caring so much about it, and then decided she did not care that she cared and did it anyway. Walter arrived at precisely 6 o'clock, which told her something about him. He was wearing a clean shirt and a jacket that had seen better years but had been brushed thoroughly, and he had shaved. The clean lines of his jaw without the scruff were surprising in a way she could not quite articulate, younger, somehow, and more open, like a landscape after the brush has been cleared. He brought a jar of honey. He handed it to Adele at the door and said, "From my bees," and Adele received it with enough enthusiasm to make Rosa realize that honey in 1882 in Kansas was not a small gift. Supper was roast chicken and cornbread, and a pot of beans and the honey over biscuits for dessert, and Walter ate with the focused appreciation of a man who ate alone most of the time and found it was a different thing altogether to eat in company. He spoke when spoken to and offered his opinions when Adele drew them out of him. He had firm views on fence law and the cattle drives and a strong opinion that the railroad was going to change everything about the territory within a decade, and he held those views the way he did everything else, quietly and without needing anyone to agree with him. Rosa asked him about his cattle. He asked her about the school. She told him about the children, about young Thomas Abernathy, who was 10 years old and could multiply 4-digit numbers in his head, but could not sit still for more than 5 minutes, and about Maria Fuentes, whose family had come up from Texas, and who translated lessons into Spanish for her little sister at home every evening, and about Samuel Pine, who was 14 and shy, and had just this week read aloud for the first time without stumbling. Walter listened to all of this with the same quality of attention she had noticed before, the kind that made you feel that what you were saying was worth saying. "You like it," he said, when she had finished. "I love it," she said without any hesitation. He looked at her for a moment. "Then you are lucky," he said. "Do you love your work?" she asked. He thought about this in that careful way of his that she was already learning to recognize, not a pause that meant he didn't have an answer, but a pause that meant he was going to give you the real one rather than the convenient one. "I like the land," he said. "I like working with my hands. The cattle are," he considered. "The cattle are a business." "But you like your land," she said. "Yes," he said, and then, after a moment, "Come and see it sometime." Adele, who had been listening to all of this with the expression of someone watching a very satisfying theatrical performance, excused herself to the kitchen with a clattering of dishes. Rosa looked at Walter across the table, which was very quiet now without Adele's cheerful commentary. "I would like that," she said. He nodded. His hands rested on the table, big and calloused, and she looked at them and thought about them on her roof in the rain, moving the shingles into place with that practiced certainty, and felt the unnamed thing in her chest change shape again, become warmer and more specific. "Tell me about the hard things," she said, and then immediately regretted it because it was too direct, too soon, and she watched him go still. But he did not shut down or leave or change the subject. He looked at the table for a moment, and then at her, and she saw something in his face that was the opposite of what she had expected, not resistance, but a kind of wearied openness, as though he had been carrying something very heavy for a long time and was considering what it might feel like to set it down. "My wife died," he said, 4 years ago, childbed fever, the baby with her." The sentence was short, the weight of it was not. "I am so sorry," Rosa said, and meant it with the full simplicity that the words deserved. He nodded. "Her name was Catherine," he said. She was a good woman. She would have liked it here." He glanced toward the window and the dark prairie beyond it. "She liked open spaces." Rosa did not say anything for a moment, and he seemed to appreciate that. "After I came west," he said, "sold the farm in Missouri, started again, felt like the right thing." "Was it?" she asked. He thought about it. "Getting there," he said. It was, Rosa thought, possibly the most honest answer she had ever received to that question from anyone in any circumstance. They sat in the warm kitchen a while longer, and Adele came back with coffee, and they talked about smaller things. The coming winter, the state of the roads, whether the Henderson Ranch was going to expand its grazing rights into the disputed quarter section north of town, which was a question with complex implications that Walter had thoughts about. And Rosa found that the smaller things felt significant in a way they often didn't, because of the person they were being discussed with. He left at 8 o'clock, with the same touch of the hat brim and the same simple directness. "Thank you," he said, to Adele and then to Rosa, and he looked at Rosa a beat longer than was strictly necessary, and she held his gaze and did not look away, and something passed between them that was quiet and important. Adele waited until she heard his horse on the road and then turned to Rosa with an expression of complete satisfaction. "Well," she said, and this time she said it in a completely different tone from the first time, a tone that meant she had made up her mind about something. "Do not start," Rosa said. "I have not said a word," Adele said serenely, and went to wash the dishes. The weeks that followed were a lesson in the particular pleasure of a slowly unfolding thing. Walter Brenner was not a man who rushed. He was not a man who performed. He came to see Rosa in ways that were, in the accounting of 1882 Caldwell, Kansas, perfectly respectable. He would stop by the schoolhouse on afternoons when she was working late to let her know the road was icing over, and she should take the shortcut through the Harmon property. Or he would leave a cord of wood stacked neatly outside the schoolhouse door on a morning, when she arrived to find the woodbox empty, and once he brought her a book. It was a well-worn copy of Thoreau's Walden that had clearly been read many times, its spine cracked in several places, and its margins full of small penciled notations in a handwriting that was careful and compressed. He handed it to her one afternoon with only a slightly self-conscious expression and said, "Thought you might like it. No hurry to return it." Rosa opened it that evening and read the marginal notes with the concentration of someone deciphering a new language, which was precisely what she was doing, learning the language of a man who expressed himself in spaces between things, who put his thoughts into margins and into actions and into the quality of his silences. She read his notations and found them perceptive and sometimes startlingly precise, and she wrote small responses to several of them in pencil, very lightly, in a different ink, and returned the book to him the following Sunday. He came back the week after that with the book and 2 mugs of coffee from the diner on Main Street, and they sat on the porch steps of the schoolhouse in the thin November sun and argued amiably about Thoreau, which was the kind of argument Rosa had not had with anyone in Caldwell and did not realize she had been missing. "He is too pleased with himself," she said. "He went to the woods and made it sound like a great spiritual adventure when really he was 20 minutes from town and his mother brought him pie." Walter made a sound that was the closest thing to a laugh she had heard from him. It was quiet, almost inward, but it was real, and it lit his face in a way that she found it very distracting. "That is a fair criticism," he said. "But he is not wrong about simplicity," she said. "About paying attention to what is actually in front of you." "No," he agreed. "He is not wrong about that." They looked out at the prairie together, at the dry grass and the enormous sky, and the handful of cattle visible on the far ridge moving like dark punctuation across the pale horizon. "Tell me something about your land," she said. He took a sip of coffee. "There is a spring on the south side of the property," he said. "Runs clear all year, even in August. The cottonwoods there turn yellow about 2 weeks before the ones in town. There is a barn owl that has lived in the old elm on the north fence for as long as I have been there. I hear it at night sometimes. It is a good sound." Rosa listened to this carefully and felt something inside her open like a window into a room she had not known was there. "That is beautiful," she said. "It is quiet," he said, "which I know is not everyone's preference." "It is mine," she said, and looked at him, and he looked at her, and this time the beat that passed between them was longer and warmer and carried more weight than any of the previous ones. The winter came in earnest in December, which anyone who had spent a winter on the Kansas plains knew was not simply cold, but comprehensively, philosophically cold. The kind that made philosophy feel very practical because you needed it to get through to spring. Rosa taught school with the wood stove burning all day and the children in their coats until noon, and she wrote lesson plans in the evenings by lamplight at the Harmons' kitchen table, and thought about the spring on the south side of Walter Brenner's land and the cottonwoods and the barn owl. He came to supper again in December, and then in January he came twice, and by February it had become something that neither of them had officially declared, but that everyone in Caldwell had formed an opinion about, including Adele Harmon, who had formed her opinion very early and wore it with the quiet satisfaction of someone who has been proven right in an interesting way. Thomas Webb, who ran the saloon on Front Street and held the informal title of person most likely to say what was true in a way that was not entirely tactful, said to Walter one evening in late January when Walter had stopped in for a single whiskey, which was the extent of his drinking, "You are sweet on the schoolteacher." Walter looked at him. "Tom," he said, in a tone that ended the conversation without being particularly aggressive about it. But Rosa had her own version of this conversation, which occurred with Margaret Patton in the general store on a cold Wednesday morning in February when Margaret looked at her over a bolt of blue cotton and said, "That man has not smiled since Catherine died, and he was in here Tuesday smiling at a jar of molasses." Rosa put down the wool she was looking at. "Margaret," she said. "I am not interfering," Margaret said, with the serenity of someone who was absolutely interfering. "I am simply observing." Rosa paid for her wool and went back into the cold with her package under her arm and the warmth of something she had finally, in the privacy of her own heart, given a name. She was in love with Walter Brenner. She had been moving in that direction since the moment she looked up through the rain at a man fixing her roof without being asked and without saying a word, and she had arrived at it fully somewhere between the margins of Thoreau and the barn owl and the spring on the south side of the property. She was in love with him the way you are in love with something that is very steady and very quiet, and therefore easy to underestimate, until you notice that it is entirely holding you up. The question was what to do about it, and in 1882 in Caldwell, Kansas, the options for a woman in love were somewhat more constrained than they might have been elsewhere, and she was sensible enough to know it. She would, she decided, wait to see what he did. And if he did not do anything, she would do something herself, because she was Rosa Langston and she had come west with a trunk of books and the belief that things worth having were worth working for, and she was not about to abandon that principle on account of romantic convention. February became March and the world began, tentatively and with some backsliding, to soften. The creek rose with snowmelt, and the first green appeared in the grassy margins of the road, and Rosa opened the schoolhouse windows for the first time in months to let in air that smelled like mud and possibility. On the first Saturday of March, Walter arrived at the Harmons' house at 10 in the morning with his big sorrel horse and a second horse, a dun mare with gentle eyes, and asked Rosa if she wanted to ride out to the property. She said yes before he finished the sentence. It was the kind of spring morning that felt like a promise that has finally been kept. Everything bright and not quite warm yet, but moving in that direction. The sky a pale blue overhead, and the grass beginning to come in green beneath the dead gold of last year's growth. They rode east from town along the creek road, not talking much, which Rosa had come to understand was not a problem but a preference, a way of letting the land speak instead of talking over it. The Brenner property revealed itself gradually over a rise, first the fence line, then the roof of the barn, then the house itself, a low, solid structure of limestone and cedar that fit the landscape the way things do when they have been built with attention rather than haste. There was a vegetable garden plot near the south wall, currently bare but carefully prepared, and a stack of seasoned wood against the north wall, and a pump handle at the side of the house that caught the morning light. They rode around the edge of the property and Walter showed her the spring, which was exactly as he had described it, clear and cold and persistent, running over a bed of pale gravel between the roots of the cottonwoods. The trees were bare still but swelling at the buds, and she could imagine what they would look like in 2 weeks when the yellow-green leaves came in. "It is wonderful," she said, and she did not mean just the spring. He stood beside her at the edge of the water and they looked at it together, and he said, quietly, "I have been thinking, Rosa." She waited. "I have been thinking that this place is better when there is someone to share it with," he said. He was not looking at her. He was looking at the water in the way of a man who finds it easier to say true things when he is not looking at the person he is saying them to. "And I have been thinking that you are—" He stopped, started again. I am not practiced at this," he said. "You are doing fine," she said, and meant it. He looked at her then, turned fully and looked at her with those gray eyes that held her the way deep water holds light, and he said, "I would like to court you properly, Rosa, if you are willing." She looked back at him and felt the full, clear weight of the moment, the spring running between them and the cottonwoods swelling above and the enormous quiet Kansas sky overhead. "I am willing," she said. He nodded, and she saw the thing in his face that she had been waiting months to see, not just the shadow of a smile but the actual thing, full and open and a little startled by itself, as though it had been waiting so long it had not expected to be called upon again. He reached out and took her hand with the same deliberate certainty with which he did everything, and they stood at the spring together for a long time, and the water ran, and the cottonwoods swelled, and it was enough. Spring proper arrived in April, and with it the cattle drive season, which transformed Caldwell from a quiet town into something considerably louder and more unpredictable. The Kishome Trail brought thousands of longhorns through each season, and with them the cowboys who drove them, and the town's saloons and stockyards roared to life, and there was a general increase in noise and dust, and the kind of male energy that Rosa had learned to navigate around with a combination of firm purposefulness and excellent peripheral vision. Walter rode with the Henderson outfit for 2 weeks in April, as he had done for the past several years to supplement the income from his own smaller herd, and Rosa found his absence more noticeable than she would have liked to admit. She taught school and visited the Pattons and had supper with Adele and wrote letters to her family in Ohio, in which she was carefully measured about Walter because she did not yet know how to describe him to people who had not met him, who would not understand that quiet was not a deficit and stillness was not coldness. He came back at the end of April with trail dust on his coat and something looser in his expression, as though 2 weeks of open country had done what open country sometimes does to a person who needs it. He came to see her the evening he returned, and they sat on the Harmons' porch, and he told her about the drive, the river crossings, and the thunderstorm that had spooked 200 cattle into a 7-mile run, and the particular grace of watching the land change as you moved south across it. "Did you miss it?" she asked. "The driving life," he thought about it. "I like the going," he said, "and I like the coming back." She understood what the coming back part meant, and it settled into her like warmth. May came and school was approaching its summer break, and Rosa was thinking about what she would do with the summer. There was the curriculum she wanted to redesign, and the materials she needed to order, and a trip to the county seat she had been putting off about the school roof, because even though Walter had made it sound again, it was still not officially the county's problem in a way that had been properly acknowledged, and she was not done fighting that battle. It was on one of these evenings in late May, when she was sitting at the schoolhouse desk after hours working on the letter to the county board, that she heard a knock at the door and called, "Come in," and Walter entered, which he had begun to do with the ease of someone who had learned that a particular place had room for him. He had something in his hand. It was a small box, the kind that came from a jewelry merchant in Wichita, and he held it with the care of a man who is extremely aware that he is holding something small and fragile and important. He put it on the desk in front of her. She looked at it. She looked at him. "You do not have to answer tonight," he said, in the tone of a man who means it entirely. She opened the box. Inside was a ring simple, a band of gold with a single small garnet set in a plain setting, and it was exactly the kind of ring she would have chosen for herself if anyone had asked her, which they never had because the kind of men who gave rings were not usually the kind of men who asked first. "Walter," she said. "I know you have your work," he said. "I would not take that from you. The county school board has been told that the schoolteacher in Caldwell intends to keep teaching regardless of her marital status, and I have been told that you once told Miss Patton the same thing, so I believe that is settled." He paused. "I want to build something with you, on the property, a life. I think," another pause, the careful kind, "I think it would be a good one." Rosa looked at the ring and then at him, and thought about the roof in the rain and the Thoreau and the spring and the cottonwoods, and 2 weeks of absence that had felt wrong in the way that absence feels wrong when you have learned what presence is supposed to feel like. "Yes," she said. He let out a breath that he had clearly been holding, and she stood up, and he put the ring on her finger, and they stood in the schoolhouse together with the evening light coming through the windows and the smell of chalk and ink and cedar all around them. And he held both her hands and looked at her with that full, startled smile, and she thought, "Yes, this is exactly right." Adele Harmon, when told, burst into tears immediately and then composed herself and announced that she would make the cake, and this was not negotiable. Margaret Patton said, "Well," in the tone that had come to mean the highest possible approval. Thomas Webb at the saloon said to anyone who would listen that he had called it in January. Rosa wrote to her parents in Ohio with considerably less restraint than her previous letters, and received a response from her mother that was so warmly enthusiastic that she read it twice, and then kept it in the top drawer of the schoolhouse desk. The wedding was in June, on a Saturday, in the church that doubled as the meeting hall. Rosa wore the blue dress with white lace at the collar that Adele had insisted on adding, and carried a small bunch of wildflowers that Walter had ridden out before dawn to pick from the meadow east of the property. He stood at the front of the church in his best jacket, which still had a better history than a future, and he watched her walk up the aisle with an expression on his face that she would remember for the rest of her life. Not the performed awe of a man who knows he is supposed to look moved, but the simple, devastated openness of a man who is in fact moved, and does not know what to do with it except to let it show. Reverend Caldwell, no relation to the town, a coincidence he was weary of explaining, performed the service with brisk sincerity, And when it was done and Walter had kissed her with the careful thoroughness of a man doing something he intended to do well, the whole church erupted in the particular fervent noise of a small community celebrating one of its own happy endings. They rode out to the property that evening as the sun was going down, trailing gold across the flat horizon in the way that only Kansas sunsets do, with an extravagance that seems almost theatrical until you have seen enough of them to understand that this is simply what they do here, every evening, whether anyone is watching or not. The house was ready. He had spent the past 2 months expanding the kitchen and adding a room on the south side with a window that looked toward the cottonwoods. It was modest and solid and built to last, and she walked through it in the evening light and ran her hand along the window sills and the kitchen table he had built himself from cedar planks, and she felt the word home settle over her like a coat that fits. He stood in the doorway and watched her take it in. "It needs curtains," he said. Adele offered. "She would," Rosa said, and laughed, and he heard her laugh and looked at her with an expression that said hearing. It was something he intended to make a habit of. The summer passed in the rhythms of a life being built. Rosa taught summer lessons to the children who wanted them, which was about half her class, and spent her mornings at the property helping with the garden and her evenings at the kitchen table planning the autumn curriculum. Walter worked the land and the cattle and was teaching her, with methodical patience, how to read the weather from the color of the sky and the behavior of the cattle. She was teaching him, with considerably less patience but more enthusiasm, to appreciate the novel she had ordered from a bookseller in Wichita, which was George Eliot's Middlemarch, and which he was reading with the same careful marginalia she had come to love in the Thoreau. He was a slow reader but a thorough one, and one evening in August he came in from the evening chores and sat down at the table and said, without preamble, Dorothea Brooke should have had better choices. Rosa looked up from her lesson plan and felt a wave of pure affection so strong it nearly knocked her over. "Yes," she said, "that is entirely the point. It is not just her problem," he said, "it is the structure of things." "Yes," she said again, and reached across the table and took his hand, and he looked at the hand and then at her, and something passed between them that was about much more than Middlemarch. In September, Rosa discovered she was expecting a child. She told Walter in the kitchen on a Sunday morning over coffee, and she watched a range of expressions move across his face in rapid and unguarded succession: startlement, something vertiginous that she recognized as fear, and then something warmer and deeper that pushed the fear aside without eliminating it, a kind of solemn joy. He was quiet for a moment. Then he set down his coffee cup and moved around the table and knelt beside her chair and took both her hands in his and looked at her with an expression so raw and honest that she felt her own eyes fill. "Are you well?" he asked. "I am very well," she said. He put his forehead against her hands just briefly, and she felt him breathe. Then he straightened and sat back down and picked up his coffee and said, "I will finish the south room before November," in a tone that meant the room would now be a nursery, and this was now the most important construction project of his life. She took November off from teaching and arranged for a young woman named Ellen Vickers, who had been educated in St. Louis and was spending the winter with her cousin in Caldwell, to take the school for the spring term. The county board, to her mild astonishment, agreed to pay Ellen's wage without complaint, which made Rosa suspicious, but she decided not to examine it too closely. The baby arrived in January of 1884, on a night so cold that Walter had stoked the wood stove to its absolute maximum, and the kitchen windows were frosted completely white. He had ridden for Mrs. Collins, the midwife, at midnight and stayed outside the door of the south room while the work was done, and Rosa was later told by Mrs. Collins that he wore a path in the porch boards pacing for 4 hours. The baby was a boy. He arrived with strong lungs and dark hair, and his father's particular expression of serious assessment of his surroundings. Walter held him for the first time with the focused care of a man handling something precious and irreplaceable, and Rosa watched her husband hold their son and felt something complete itself inside her that she had not known was incomplete. "He needs a name," she said. Walter looked at the baby for a long time. "James," he said. "For my father, if you are willing." "James," she said, and it fit. The spring came and Rosa went back to the schoolhouse with James in a cradle in the corner of the room while she taught, which the children adored, and which the county board had no opinion about because she did not ask for one. She had explained to the board, in a letter of considerable precision, that a teaching mother was not a problem, and that children who grew up seeing women work with infants were learning something valuable about the world. The county board had responded with the diplomatic silence of men who had learned that this particular schoolteacher was easier to agree with than to argue against. It was a good time. It was genuinely, unreservedly, a good time, the kind that you know is good while it is happening and not just in retrospect. And Rosa knew it, and savored it with the purposeful attention of someone who has learned that good times deserve to be acknowledged rather than taken for granted. Walter built a coop that spring and they got chickens, which was Rosa's idea, and which Walter regarded with the polite skepticism of a cattleman toward all non-cattle animals, and which he was also, she noticed, entirely willing to feed every morning before she was awake. He fixed the south fence where the winter had pulled it loose and turned the vegetable garden twice as large as the previous year. And in the evenings when James was down they sat on the porch and watched the cottonwoods come in and talked about the things that interested them, which was everything, in varying degrees. She told him more about Ohio, about the house she had grown up in and her father who taught arithmetic at the local school and her mother, who had been the first person to put a book in her hands and tell her she could go anywhere from here. He told her more about Missouri, about the farm where he had grown up and learned to use tools from a father who believed that a man who could not fix something was at the mercy of everything, and about Catherine, gradually and in small pieces, the way grief is best handled, not all at once but in increments, each one a little lighter than the last. She was glad he had loved Catherine. She had found, to her own surprise, that this did not make her small or jealous, but instead made her feel a kinship with someone she had never met, who had seen what Rosa saw in this man and had loved him for it and left him too soon. She kept a quiet tenderness toward that memory and never tried to compete with it, because you do not compete with grief, you make room for it, and Walter seemed to understand that she had made room and loved her for it. James grew with the singular speed of babies everywhere, and by his first birthday was pulling himself upright on the kitchen table and looking out the window at the cattle with an expression that was unmistakably his father's. Rosa's mother came from Ohio in the summer of 1885 to meet him, making the trip by train to Wichita and then by stage to Caldwell, and arrived with a large trunk of books and a smaller trunk of opinions about Kansas, which she revised substantially upward upon meeting Walter, who spent an entire Sunday morning showing her the spring and the cottonwoods, and made her a cup of coffee that she declared the best she had ever had. "He is a good man," Rosa's mother said privately to Rosa that evening, which was the same thing Margaret Patton had said 3 years ago and which had, if anything, become more true. "He is," Rosa said. "He is a very good man." The autumn of 1885 brought an interesting problem in the form of the County Board of Education, which had apparently been replaced by a new chairman named Aldous Crane, who held the view, stated in an official letter to the Caldwell Schoolhouse, that married women with children should not be employed as teachers because it set a poor example of domestic priorities for the female students. Rosa read this letter twice. Then she set it on the kitchen table and looked at Walter, who was reading it over her shoulder with an expression that had gone very still in the particular way it went when he was making a calculation. "They cannot simply dismiss me," she said. "I have a contract through the spring term." "No," he agreed, They cannot dismiss you through the spring. After that they can decline to renew." She tapped the letter. "Then I have until spring to make this impossible for them." He looked at her with that interior amusement that she loved. "What are you going to do?" "I am going to get the parents involved," she said. "Every parent of every child in that school. Because if Aldous Crane thinks the mothers of Caldwell are going to allow him to take away the teacher their children love, he does not know the mothers of Caldwell." Walter picked up the letter, folded it, and set it back down. "He does not know you," he said, and there was something in the way he said it that made the statement feel like both an observation and a declaration. Rosa did exactly what she said she would do. She organized a meeting at the church hall in October and invited every parent in the district, and she stood at the front of the room and explained the situation plainly and without embellishment, and then she sat down and let the room speak for itself. It spoke for approximately 45 minutes, with considerable volume. 17 parents signed a petition that Margaret Patton delivered personally to the county seat, accompanied by a letter from Reverend Caldwell, a letter from Dr. Morrison, who was the town's only physician, and a separate letter from Thomas Webb, who turned out to write with remarkable force and specificity when he was angry about something. Aldous Crane renewed Rosa's contract in November. His letter of notification did not address any of the previous correspondence, which Rosa considered a perfectly satisfactory outcome. Walter, when she told him, looked up from the harness he was mending and said, "Good," and went back to work, and she stood in the doorway of the barn and felt happily, expansively married to the right person. The years moved with the steady pace of seasons genuinely inhabited. James grew into a boy who had his mother's curiosity and his father's thoughtfulness and both parents' stubbornness in a combination that kept life interesting. By the time he was 4, he was attending Rosa's school and had decided that arithmetic was his primary interest, which delighted Rosa because it was the one subject she had always found somewhat mechanical. In 1887, their daughter arrived. They named her Clara for no particular historical reason except that when Rosa held her for the first time and looked at her face, she said, "She looks like a Clara," and Walter said, "Then Clara it is," with the same simplicity with which he made all his decisions. Clara was different from James in the way that children in the same family are always different in ways that make you understand something new about the fullness of people. She was louder and faster and more immediately social, already reaching for faces at 2 weeks old with an interested directness that made Walter say, in a tone of delighted recognition, "She is like you." Rosa took that as the compliment it was clearly intended to be. The schoolhouse had, by now, become something more than a building. It had acquired, over Rosa's years of teaching, the particular character that a room gets when it has been the site of consistent, focused human effort toward something good. There were maps on the walls that the students had helped draw. There was a globe that Rosa had finally convinced the county board to purchase in 1886 after a campaign of 2 years. There were drawings pinned along the east wall, rotating seasonally, and a shelf of books that had grown from Rosa's original collection to something that Caldwell's more literary citizens occasionally came in to borrow. The roof had held perfectly. Every spring Rosa examined it with the eye of someone who had learned what good work looks like, and every spring it was sound, the cedar shingles weathered now to a silver gray that matched the old timber of the walls. She thought about the morning she had looked up through the rain at a stranger on her roof, and she thought about it differently every year, sometimes with amusement, and sometimes with tenderness, and sometimes with a gratitude so deep it was almost reverent. She told the story to her children when they were old enough to appreciate it. James heard it first, at 6 years old, sitting at the kitchen table eating biscuits on a rainy afternoon, and he looked at his father with the critical assessment of a 6-year-old evaluating an adult decision and said, "Why didn't you just tell her what you were doing?" Walter looked at his son across the table. "I figured the doing of it said what needed saying," he said. James considered this for a moment. "That is a strange way to talk to someone," he said. "It worked," Walter said. Rosa, who was pretending to read her lesson plan journal and was in fact watching all of this with complete and private delight, said without looking up, "It did work." James thought about it some more. "I think I would just say the thing," he said. "Good," Rosa said. "You should. But understand that some people say things in other ways. Your father fixes things. That is his language. You will need to learn to hear it." James thought about this seriously, the way he thought about arithmetic problems, turning it over from several angles. "Like when he fixed the fence before the storm last week," he said, "and we did not even know there was going to be a storm." "Exactly like that," Rosa said. Walter had picked up his coffee cup and was looking out the window at the rain with an expression that might have been mild embarrassment and was definitely something warmer. And Rosa thought that this kitchen, this rainy afternoon, these children, this man, was the thing she had been moving toward since the day she packed her trunk in Ohio and decided to go west. Clara was 3 when the Henderson Ranch had the big trouble that affected most of the ranchers in the county. A prolonged drought through the summer of 1889, followed by a hard, early winter, had devastated the cattle herds across the region. And the Hendersons, who had overextended their credit in the boom years, were forced to sell off a significant portion of their land and stock. Several families who worked for them or depended on their business were in serious difficulty. Walter organized, quietly and without any particular announcement, a series of practical measures. He coordinated with 2 other ranchers to share feed costs through the winter. He helped the Fuentes family, whose patriarch had injured himself in September, with their cattle work through November, and he gave a quarter of cord of his seasoned wood to 3 families who were short before the first real cold came in. He did not mention any of this to Rosa in any ceremonial way. She found out about most of it from Margaret Patton, who found out about everything. "Your husband," Margaret said one morning in November in a tone that had moved well beyond approval into something approaching reverence, "is a very good man." "I know," Rosa said. "He fixed Tom Fuentes' fence last Saturday while Tom was laid up," Margaret said. "Tom tried to pay him and he would not take it." Rosa was quiet for a moment. She was thinking about a roof in the rain, about a first principle that had never changed. "That is who he is," she said. The drought eased in the following year and things slowly recovered. Walter's herd came through the winter better than most because he had planned carefully and refused to overextend, which was consistent with everything else about him. By 1891, Caldwell had grown considerably. The railroad had come, as Walter had predicted years ago, and with it a new energy that was different from the cattle drive energy, more settled, more commercial, less rough around the edges. New families arrived from the East and from Europe, and Rosa's school grew to the point where the county board was forced to acknowledge that 1 room and 1 teacher were no longer sufficient for the student population. She spent the better part of a year negotiating for an addition to the schoolhouse and a second teacher, and finally received both a young man named Frederick Mills, who had been educated at the Kansas State Normal School, and who Rosa spent considerable time training in her particular philosophy of education, which could be summarized as, pay attention to what each child actually needs, and then provide that rather than what is convenient for you. Frederick Mills turned out to be an excellent teacher and a quick learner, and eventually the dearest professional colleague Rosa had in 20 years of teaching, but that is somewhat ahead of the story. James was 8 years old when Clara was 4, and both of them old enough to attend school together, James in the upper room with Rosa and Clara in the lower with Frederick, which caused Clara exactly 1 morning of objection, before she decided that Mr. Mills was very interesting and forgot she had intended to be in her mother's room. Walter, watching his children file into the schoolhouse on the first day of the new arrangement, said to Rosa, who was standing beside him on the road, "You built that." "I built some of it," she said. "The county built some of it, you built some of it." He shook his head slightly. "It is yours," he said. "It was yours from the beginning." She looked at the schoolhouse, at the roof, particularly, where the cedar shingles had long since blended to an even silver gray, indistinguishable from one another, old and new grown together into something continuous and sound. "Ours," she said. He put his arm around her on the road in front of the schoolhouse at 7:30 in the morning on a school day in 1892, in full view of the arriving students and their parents and Margaret Patton, who had chosen this particular morning to stand outside the general store, and he held her against his side with the particular certainty of a man who knows where he belongs, and she leaned into him with the certainty of a woman who knows the same thing. The years kept moving as they do. In 1893, Rosa's father died in Ohio, quickly and of a heart complaint that had not announced itself, and she took the train east with Clara, who was 6, to help her mother arrange things and spend a month with her family. Walter stayed to work the property and tend to James, who was 9 and not ready for the trip, and Rosa wrote him letters every 4 days and received letters back short, careful letters in his compressed handwriting that said less on paper than he could say in a room, but that she read with the full understanding of the language she had spent years learning. One of them said only, "The cottonwoods are coming in early this year. James says hello. I find the house very quiet. Come home when you are ready." She went home 10 days earlier than she had planned. Her mother came the following summer and stayed 2 months and developed a genuine affection for Walter that expressed itself in teaching him to play chess, which he took to with the methodical seriousness he brought to everything, and at which he became, within 6 weeks, very difficult to beat. Rosa's mother declared this unsurprising. Rosa agreed. In 1895, Rosa began teaching adult classes 2 evenings a week for the growing number of immigrant families who needed English instruction. It was not part of her contract, and the county board was not consulted, and she did not ask anyone's permission. She simply announced it, and it happened. Among her adult students were 3 young women from a Polish family named Cowboy, a German farmer named Hauptmann who was 60 years old and had decided that learning English was overdue, and a young Mexican couple, the Garcias, who had come up from the territories and were determined to make their papers in order, which Rosa was glad to help with by connecting them with the county clerk, a new man who was considerably more cooperative than his predecessor. Walter came to the schoolhouse on Tuesday evenings and sat in the back while she taught and then walked her home, which she told him was entirely unnecessary since the schoolhouse was a 1/4 mile from the property, and which he continued to do anyway. She loved him for it every Tuesday without saying so, because she had learned from him that sometimes you say things by doing them, and she had decided that their particular domestic language was going to be bilingual. The children grew. James at 14 was already taller than his mother and beginning, to his own apparent surprise, to be interested in the kind of large-scale engineering questions that the new century was starting to make relevant. He was fascinated by the mechanics of the railroad and by the telegraphs, and by a magazine article about electrical lighting that had found its way to the Caldwell library, and that he read so many times the pages softened at the edges. Clara at 10 was her father's companion in the garden and her mother's student in everything else, and had developed a particular gift for languages that expressed itself in the adult English class as a habit of sitting in and translating for the Polish sisters while Rosa was not looking. "She is helpful," Rosa said to Walter one evening, not quite managing to sound disapproving. "She is," he agreed, not trying at all to sound disapproving. "She is also 10 years old and should be in bed on Tuesday evenings," said Walter, in the tone of a man who was not going to be the one to discourage a 10-year-old from doing something both useful and admirable. Rosa looked at him. He looked at the ceiling, which was a habit he had developed in the face of moral complexity. "You are no help," she said. "Clara can speak 4 languages," he said. "More or less. More or less is not the same as—" She translated for Mrs. Kowalczyk at the dry goods store last week, and Mrs. Kowalczyk cried. Rosa stopped. Mrs. Cowboy cried because a 10-year-old helped her when she did not know how to ask for what she needed, Walter said. In the measured way he said things that he felt should be self-evidently correct. Rosa was quiet for a moment. "Fine," she said, "but she has to be in bed by 9. 9, he agreed. Clara was in bed by 9:15, which was close enough that Rosa decided to be content with it. The spring of 1897 brought an unexpected visitor in the form of a letter from a man named Harold Trent, who identified himself as a representative of the state normal school in Emporia, and who had apparently heard of Rosa's work through a teacher named Abernathy, young Thomas Abernathy, her former student, who had grown up and gone to the normal school himself and become, against all odds given his inability to sit still at age 10, a teacher of considerable reputation. Harold Trent wrote to say that the normal school was developing a new curriculum for rural frontier teachers, and would Rosa be willing to consult on it. She read the letter 3 times. Then she put it on the kitchen table and went out to the barn where Walter was working on the roof of the storage shed. He had, over 15 years, repaired or built most of the outbuildings on the property, and the shed roof had been suffering from the previous winter. She told him about the letter. He listened from the top of the ladder. "Will you go?" he said. "It would mean a trip to Emporia," she said, "3 days at least." Looked at her from the ladder in a way that said he found the hesitation surprising. "Rosa," he said, "go. The children, James is 14, he said. Clara is 11. I will manage for 3 days. She looked at him. He looked back at her with the absolute steadiness that had been one of the first things she ever loved about him and was still one of the most sustaining. "You have been teaching on this frontier for 15 years, he said. "You know what it needs. Go tell them." She went to Emporia. She spent 4 days there, consulting with Harold Trent and 4 other experienced teachers on the rural curriculum, and she came back with 3 pages of notes that she then spent 6 months turning into a formal written set of recommendations that was eventually incorporated into the training materials for Kansas rural teachers. Her name appeared on the cover alongside Harold Trent's, which the County Board of Education noted with a slightly surprised approval that made Rosa feel something between amusement and vindication. Thomas Abernathy, who was 22 by now and teaching 30 miles away, wrote her a letter that said, simply, "I told them about you, and I am glad they listened." She kept that letter in the schoolhouse desk, next to her mother's letter from the year of the wedding. By the turn of the century, Caldwell had grown into something that would have been unrecognizable to the town of 1882, and yet the essential character of it, the particular mixture of hard practicality and genuine community, and the kind of help people give each other without being asked. Because on the prairie you know that the need is real even when it isn't stated, that essential character held. Rosa had been part of it for nearly 20 years. Walter had been part of it a little longer. Together they had been part of it in a way that felt, to both of them, like the truest thing either of them had ever done. James, at 17, had decided definitively that he wanted to study engineering, and the question of where was beginning to feel urgent. Rosa wrote letters to the University of Kansas in Lawrence and the Kansas State Agricultural College in Manhattan, and spent an entire Sunday afternoon in September of 1900, going through the responses with James at the kitchen table while Walter sat nearby with the newspaper, reading and occasionally making a comment that was, as usual, precisely to the point. "Manhattan is better for what he wants to do," Walter said, looking at the prospectus over James's shoulder. "The agricultural engineering program." "I want to build bridges," James said. "Agricultural engineers build bridges," Walter said, "and irrigation systems and railroad infrastructure. You will not be short of things to build." James looked at the prospectus. He looked at his father. "Did you ever wish you had studied somewhere?" he asked. Walter thought about it. "I wish I had read more," he said. "Your mother fixed that." He paused. "But I like the work I do. I like making things with my hands. That is not wrong, James. Going to school is also not wrong. Do the thing that calls to you." James went to the Kansas State Agricultural College in the fall of 1901 and sent letters home twice a week for the first term, and once a week after that when he had settled in. And each one described something new and specific about what he was learning. And Rosa read them to Walter at the kitchen table, and they were both quietly and consistently proud in the way that parents are proud when their child is doing exactly what they are meant to do. Clara, at 14, had by now become the unofficial translator for most of the immigrant families in Caldwell's growing community, and she had also, without announcing it, become the person who appeared at the schoolhouse after hours when Rosa was working late with a tin of biscuits and a very competent ability to grade the younger students' slates, which Rosa pretended not to rely on and absolutely relied on. She was going to be a teacher, Rosa thought. She had been going to be a teacher since she was 4 years old and chose to sit in the back of the adult English class rather than go to bed. And the only thing that would change was when she would receive the formal acknowledgement of it. In 1904, Rosa turned 48 and Walter turned 52, which were birthdays that she marked with the particular reflectiveness of middle age, not with regret, but with a kind of grateful taking stock, the way you count something valuable to make sure you know how much you have. She stood on the porch on a September evening with a cup of tea and looked at the cottonwoods in their autumn gold, which they had seen turn yellow together now for more than 20 years, and she thought about a woman standing alone in a leaking schoolhouse in 1882, listening to the rain and the world feeling very precarious. Walter came out and stood beside her. He had gray now at his temples and the lines around his eyes had deepened, but the essential quality of him, that stillness, that attending quality, that absolute reliability was the same as it had always been, was if anything more itself than it had been at 30 because the years had stripped away the things that were not essentially him and left only what was. He stood beside her and looked at the cottonwoods. "What are you thinking about?" she asked. "The spring," he said, "needs clearing before November." "The dead wood has been collecting on the north side," she laughed. "I am thinking about 22 years ago," she said, "and you are thinking about the spring." He looked at her. "I was thinking about that this morning," he said. "I did not know you were going to bring it up." "What were you thinking about it?" she asked. He was quiet for a moment in the way that meant he was going to say the real thing. "I was thinking that I did not know what I was doing," he said. "That morning, I just saw the roof was leaking and it seemed like a thing that should be fixed. I was not thinking about anything beyond that." "I know," she said. "But it is the thing I am most glad of," he said. "In my whole life, getting up on that roof." She put her hand in his. The cottonwoods stood golden in the evening light, and the creek ran where it had always run, and the barn owl called once from the old elm, its voice clear and distinct in the quiet air. "So am I," she said. They stood there a while longer. The last light went from the sky, and the stars came in over the prairie in the vast, indifferent profusion of stars that the Kansas plains allow, because there is nothing to block the view for 100 miles in any direction, and the night was cool and clean and very still. James came home for Christmas of 1904 with a young woman named Helen Marsh, who was studying at the Lawrence campus, and who was studying, Rosa was delighted to discover, civil law with an eye toward advocating for land rights in the territories, which was a field in which there was more need than practitioners, and which Rosa thought was exactly the right kind of work. James looked at Helen the way Walter had looked at Rosa on their wedding day, with the simple and somewhat startled openness of a man who cannot believe his good fortune. And Rosa looked at this, and felt a very specific and beautiful emotion that is only available to parents watching their children find the right thing. Walter shook James's hand at the door, which was unusual because they were not a formal family, and then pulled him into a brief, tight embrace, which told Rosa everything she needed to know about what Walter thought of Helen Marsh. Clara, who was 17 and in her last year of school, watched all of this with the alert intelligence she brought to human situations and said later to Rosa, "James has good taste." "He does," Rosa said. "He learned it from his father." Clara thought about this for a moment. "Papa chose you," she said, and then grinned. I suppose that does set a standard. Rosa threw the dish towel at her. The following spring Clara applied to the Kansas State Normal School in Emporia, the same school that had sent the letter to Rosa 8 years earlier, and was accepted, and spent the summer before she left working in the school with Frederick Mills and Rosa, and learning the formal craft of what she had been doing informally for years. She was going to be a good teacher. She was already a good teacher. The formality of the qualification was simply the world catching up with what was already true. On the morning Clara left on the stage to Wichita, and then the train to Emporia, Walter loaded her trunk and her bags, and then stood by the road while she said her goodbyes to Rosa, who managed not to cry until Clara was actually on the stage, and the horses were moving, and then cried with the full-throated helplessness of a woman who has been keeping it together for approximately 20 minutes longer than was strictly comfortable. Walter gave her his handkerchief. "She is going to be wonderful," he said. "I know," Rosa said into the handkerchief. "That does not make the stage any slower." He put his arm around her shoulders and they stood at the edge of the road until the stage was out of sight and the dust had settled and the sparrows had come back to the fence posts and the morning had re-established its ordinary self. "The spring needs clearing," he said. She laughed. She always laughed when he said practical things at the exact right moment. "Yes," she said, "it does." They walked back to the house together through the September morning, and it was quiet in the way of a house that has been full of children and is not yet accustomed to being full of only two, but it was not an empty quiet. It was the quality quiet of two people who had built something together and who knew the building was not done. In 1906, James and Helen married in Lawrence, a simple ceremony that Rosa and Walter attended, and Rosa stood in the back of the room and watched James stand at the front with the same expression Walter had worn 23 years ago, and she reached for Walter's hand and found it already reaching for hers. Helen moved into the practice of land rights law with a tenacity and precision that Rosa recognized as the kind of commitment that makes lasting change. And James began working with the Kansas State Engineering Office on infrastructure projects for the expanding rural road network, which was the kind of work he had been made for. Clara graduated from the normal school in 1907 and took a teaching position in a town 40 miles from Caldwell, a small community called Harper, where she was the only teacher for a school of 22 students, which was exactly the situation she had been trained for by 20 years of watching her mother. She wrote letters home twice a week, and they were full of the particular energy of someone doing work they love for the first time with full authority, and Rosa read them to Walter at the kitchen table, and they were, as before, quietly and consistently proud. The year 1908 brought two things that arrived in the same month. The first was a letter from the Kansas Department of Education informing Rosa that she had been selected for a citation of distinguished service in rural education, which she received with genuine pleasure and very little drama. The second was the news from James that Helen was expecting, which Rosa received with considerably more drama and spent 3 days writing a letter in response that was, by any measure, excessive in its enthusiasm. Walter read the letter before she sent it. He handed it back to her and said, "Perhaps one fewer paragraph about the spring." "I was drawing a metaphor," she said. "It was a long metaphor," he said. She cut the spring paragraph. The letter was still very long. The grandchild arrived in April of 1909, a boy, which James had apparently inherited from his parents as a pattern, and was named Daniel Walter Brenner, which Rosa discovered when James wrote to tell her, and which made her set the letter down for a moment and go find Walter in the barn and read it to him there. He stood very still for a moment. Then he took the letter from her and read it himself, carefully, with his eyes moving slowly over the words the way he read everything he was going to read more than once. He handed it back. His voice, when he said, "Good name," was not entirely steady, and she loved him for it. They went to Lawrence in May to meet Daniel Walter Brenner, who was 6 weeks old and already demonstrating, in Rosa's strongly objective opinion, exceptional alertness for his age. Walter held him with the same focused care with which he had held James 25 years before, and Daniel looked up at his grandfather with the large, investigating gaze of a new person encountering the world, and Walter looked back at him with an expression of such complete and undefended tenderness that Rosa felt something move through her that was too large for a word. She took Walter's hand. He held the baby and her hand simultaneously for a long, quiet moment, and the afternoon light came through the window of James and Helen's house, and it was one of the best moments she had ever been in. Clara came home for Christmas of 1909 with a young man from Harper, a farmer named Eli Morris, who was 26 years old and soft-spoken, and clearly dazzled by Clara in the way that made Rosa immediately relaxed about him. Because a man who is dazzled by Clara Brenner but not intimidated by her is a man of good character and adequate self-possession. Walter spent a Sunday morning showing Eli the property, which was the same thing he had done with Rosa 27 years ago, and came back looking satisfied in a quiet way that told Rosa everything she needed to know. Clara and Eli married the following spring in Caldwell, in the same church where Rosa and Walter had been married, with James and Helen and Daniel in the front row and Adele Harmon, who was 76 and still formidable, in the second row, and Margaret Patton, who was 81 and had not planned to come but showed up anyway and said she was just passing, in the third. Rosa stood beside Walter at the back of the church and watched Clara walk up the aisle, her daughter, who had been born on a January night when the windows were frosted white, and who had been translating for immigrants at 10, and was now 22 and radiant in a way that was about more than the dress or the flowers or the day, and she felt the perfect, completed circle of something that had begun on a rainy morning in a leaking schoolhouse when a man got on a roof without being asked and without saying a word. She had said yes when he asked her name. She had said yes when he asked to court her. She had said yes when he offered the ring at the schoolhouse desk. Every yes had been the right one, and here they all were, all those yesies, looking at each other in the long morning light of a May wedding in the church in Caldwell. Walter put his arm around her and she put her head against his shoulder, and they stood there while their daughter was married, and everything that had needed to be said had been said, and everything that had needed to be fixed had been fixed, and the life they had built together was standing all around them, solid and sound, like cedar shingles fitted perfectly against the rain. After the wedding, when the celebration had moved to the church hall and the fiddle music had started, and Clara and Eli were dancing, and James was dancing with Helen and little Daniel was asleep on Rosa's shawl in the corner, Walter came and found Rosa where she was standing near the window watching all of it. "Dance with me," he said. She looked at him. He was 58 years old and gray at the temples, and his boots were not the right kind for dancing, and he knew it perfectly well and was asking anyway. She took his hand. They danced with the careful inexactitude of two people who had never made dancing a priority and who were doing it now not for the dancing but for what the dancing meant, and she laughed against his shoulder, and he put his hand on her back and steered them safely around the edge of the room away from the more energetic participants, and it was deeply, perfectly right. "Do you remember," she said, as they moved slowly through the music, "the first time you came to supper, you brought honey?" "From my bees," he said. "You gave it to Adele," she said. "Very wise." "I was terrified," he said. She looked up at him. "Were you?" "Yes," he said, simply and without embarrassment, the way he admitted to things that were true. "You did not look it," she said. "I never look it," he said. "It does not mean I am not." She held his hand more tightly and thought about all the things he had been while not looking it, afraid and grieving and hopeful and in love, all the interior weather of a man who expressed his feelings in shingles and honey jars and barn owls and marginalia, and who had offered her all of it in the language he had, which she had spent 27 years learning, and which she still found new in it. "I love you," she said simply, because they were not children and the words did not need ornamentation. He looked at her with those gray, creek-bottom eyes and said, "I know," and then, "I love you, Rosa, I always have." The fiddle played and the children danced and Daniel slept in the corner on her shawl, and the evening light came through the windows of the church hall in Caldwell, Kansas, and it was enough. It was completely and entirely enough and more. The years after the wedding settled into the kind of time that is good in a deep and quiet way. The way that a house that has been built correctly is good. Not dramatic in its goodness, but reliable, warm, solid against whatever the weather brings. Rosa taught school until 1914, when she was 58 years old and the new county superintendent, a young woman named Frances Doyle, who was the first woman to hold that position, and whose appointment Rosa had advocated for with the same purposeful stubbornness she brought to everything, told her that she had trained more teachers who were now working across the state than any other single educator in Sumner County's history. Rosa received this information and went home and told Walter, who was sitting on the porch in the late afternoon light with a cup of coffee and the newspaper, and said, after she had finished, "So you are a legend." "I am retired," she said. "Both can be true," he said. She sat down beside him and they looked at the cottonwoods, which were 50 years old now by Walter's estimate and considerably larger than they had been in 1882, their trunks thick and their canopy generous, the kind of trees that had become part of the landscape so completely that imagining the spring without them was impossible. Clara and Eli had a son in 1911 and a daughter in 1913, and they came home to Caldwell for summers. And the house that had been quiet since 1905 was full again in June and July, which Walter regarded with a contentment that expressed itself in the way he always expressed contentment, by fixing things. He built a swing on the big elm behind the house for the grandchildren, and repaired the chicken coop roof, and cleared the spring every autumn without fail. And when James and Helen brought Daniel to visit, Daniel climbed everything, and Walter followed him around with the patient vigilance of a grandfather who has decided that experience of the world is important, and that his role is to ensure the world is as safe as possible while allowing the experience. Daniel was 6 when he first asked Walter to teach him how to use a hammer, and Walter spent a patient Saturday afternoon showing him the grip and the swing, and Rosa watched from the kitchen window and felt a warmth in her chest that was entirely distinct from the warmth of the wood stove. In 1916, Walter was 64 and slowing slightly, not in any alarming way, not in any way that changed his fundamental self, but in the way that the body begins to negotiate with the work it has always done, asking for a little more time and offering a little more complaint. He was still on the property every day, still at the spring clearing every autumn, still fixing the things that needed fixing. But Rosa had begun quietly taking on the carrying tasks herself, and learned not to make it obvious, which was easier than she expected because he was the same way with her, subtly ensuring that she had a chair when she needed one, and that the water was fetched before she had to ask. James came home in the summer of 1916 for 3 weeks with Helen and Daniel, who was now 7 and possessed of an engineering ambition that already manifested in the construction of highly ambitious structures from whatever materials were available in the farmyard. Walter spent the first week of the visit working beside James on the barn door that had been giving trouble, and Rosa watched them from the house, her son who was 32 and her husband who was 64, working side by side with the same unhurried precision, and thought that some things pass between fathers and sons that are never spoken aloud and are more completely transmitted for it. In the evenings they sat on the porch, all of them together, and the conversation moved the way it moves in families who have learned to talk to each other, easily and with room for silence, and with the freedom to disagree that comes from knowing that the disagreement does not threaten the love. One evening Daniel was sitting on the porch steps at Walter's feet, listening to the adults talk about something or other, and he said, out of nowhere, in the earnest way of a 7-year-old pursuing something he has been thinking about, Grandpa, Mama says you fixed Grandma's roof when it was raining and you didn't even know each other. Walter looked down at his grandson. That is true, he said. Why did you do that? Daniel said. Walter was quiet for a moment in the way Rosa knew was the pause before the real answer. Because it needed doing, he said, and I could do it. Daniel thought about this. But why without asking, he said. Sometimes asking takes longer than doing, Walter said. Daniel thought about this some more. He had his grandfather's quality of taking his time with things, and Rosa loved him for it the way she loved Walter for it. Did Grandma like it? He said. Walter looked at Rosa across the porch. Ask her, he said. Daniel turned to look at Rosa with his large, patient eyes. Very much, she said. It was the beginning of everything. Daniel nodded as though this satisfied him, and went back to watching the evening come in over the prairie. And the conversation moved on, and the stars came out one by one over the Kansas plains in their enormous, indifferent abundance. And the barn owl called from the old elm, and the creek ran at the edge of the property where the cottonwoods grew tall and gold, and Walter reached across the space between the porch chairs and took Rosa's hand, and she held it as she had held it for 30 years. With the certainty of someone holding something they have no intention of letting go. Everything had been fixed, and fixed well. The roof that began it all had long since blended into the building it protected, its cedar grown old and silver and strong. The schoolhouse still stood, larger now than it had been and still full of children working their slates by morning light, and learning the names of rivers and the properties of numbers, and all the million things that the world contained for the ones willing to pay attention. Rosa's name was on the wall of the county education office in a modest framed document that she had not asked for, and that mattered less to her than the knowledge that somewhere in Kansas, teachers who had learned from her were sitting in classrooms exactly like the one in Caldwell, paying attention to children, one at a time. Walter's land was as he had found it and better, the spring clear, the cottonwoods tall, the barn owl in its elm, the vegetable garden twice the size of what it had been and producing more than they could eat, which meant there was always something to give away, which was how it had always been with him. The life they had built between them was solid and full and shaped like exactly what it was, a love story that began in the rain with a man and a hammer and a woman holding a bucket and two people who each spoke in their own language and had the patience and the sense to learn each other's. It was, in the end, exactly enough. It was, in the way of all the truest things, considerably more.